including Said, and to present our experience about muscular dystrophy in Tunisia. You know, Tunisia is a small country with almost around 10 million inhabitants, with a very important rural population, but because of consanguinity, because of a lot of cultural backgrounds, including very rich genetic background, since Tunisian population was Berbers, Arab, Phoenicians, Turkish, Europeans, and also because of the high rate of consanguineous marriage. We saw since many years ago, and we have a high prevalence of autosomal recessive inheritance, and the pedigree that you see there, is very frequently encountered in our routine practice. And Tunisia is a good opportunity to study autosomal recessive neurogenetic disorders. This slides, this plan of Tunisia map, was taken from Lancet Neurology. I am very proud about it because I am sure that the editor of Lancet Neurology didn't know Tunisia before we sent him the paper, and he found that there is very high prevalence of Parkinson's disease, and he is looking from where this population, genetic forms of LRRK2 and of LRRK2, and he is looking from where all these patients are coming. It's why the front page of Lancet Neurology, he put the map of Tunisia with all this migration. In any case, Tunisia is very good for genetics, maybe not for patients, because the country is small, and the family was still large, and there are, I think, good clinical expertise that coming back down, unfortunately now. And there is very, very proximity of public health sector to population. It's why it is very easy to gather a lot of patients and all the family members of the patients, what is a paradise and for neurologists. I am working in National Institute of Neurology, built in 1974 by Moji Ben Hamida. Now his name is Moji Ben Hamida, National Institute of Neurology. I am head of department. There is 5 departments, 7 departments almost. And the Department of Neurology have indoor patients, outdoor patients, neurophysiological units, and molecular laboratory lab with neuropathology facilities, muscle biopsy, brain studies, muscle biopsy, and now, since 30 years ago, I say no because we never know that we are coming older and older. We have molecular biology. Indeed, because of the frequency of all these diseases, we have my boss before, Moji Ben Hamida, focused on neurogenetic disorders before all this molecular biology. And this allowed our group to identify a lot of disease, newly identified, as what we call it Tunisian muscular dystrophy, and we will see this history, juvenile ALS, ataxia with vitamin E deficiency, which was very frequent ataxia in Tunisia, of course, LGMD2I, LRRK2 phenotype, and LRRK2 gene. And more recently, 2 years ago, we mapped a new gene of autosomal recessive ataxia, GBA2 ataxia. Our group also have been contributed, sometimes alone, sometimes with large collaboration, to developing at least 15 loci and identified many genes. What about autosomal recessive limb-girdle muscular dystrophy? That is the photographs of the first paper made by Ben Hamida. Good to have some historical. And after Myron, there is a problem with my slides. Myron first described the disease 180 years in UK. And the ancestor of Myron was from Nantes. He's French, but he is an English neurologist who described the disease. But now it's Duchenne who give very good description of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is most frequent X-linked disease that we heard about it a lot. But when we look to the neurology literature, we saw that John Walton, in 1954, reported what we call now limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. And he said that is very important because we never read very well all the literature. Everything have been written, but not read, I think so. He say, in our opportunity, there is cases should be regarded as distinct clinical and genetic grounds, and we suggest to call it limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. And he said that the onset may be variable, and the clinical phenotype is involvement of girdle muscles, pelvic, and after arm muscles. Even if a lot of things have been reported when I was young resident, people, when we have a boy with muscular dystrophy, he said he's Duchenne, a girl, spinal muscular atrophy. It was not well known that we can have Duchenne-like muscular dystrophy with autosomal recessive inheritance. Until 1977, Ben Hamida, coming back from France and from US, he found a lot of patients with phenotype of Duchenne, but they are girls. And the first paper, 1977, he called it Duchenne fille, what's mean in English, Duchenne girl. And in 1983, very big description on a large series of patients with collaboration of my French boss, Michel Fardeau, about what we called SCARD, autosomal recessive severe childhood muscular dystrophy frequent in Tunisia. And a lot of people thought that we are describing spinal muscular atrophy because of pseudomyopathic changes on muscle in spinal muscular atrophy because AMG may show, and didn't believe it at all. But things will change with molecular genetics. Description of dystrophin gene, identification, what we call it, associated, dystrophin-associated glycoproteins by Campbell and Ozawa, 2 groups. And we showed in 1990 that dystrophin was normally expressed in muscles of these patients with autosomal recessive Duchenne-like muscular dystrophy. At this time, we call it Tunisian muscular dystrophy because we thought that it exists only in Tunisia. In 1992, Kamel Ben Othman, one of our fellows, mapped the gene on chromosome 13. And the year next, 1933, Azibi take a lot of patients from Algeria and found that 50 kilodalton dystrophin-associated protein, which alpha-sarcoglycan, was absent in scalps. It's why they call it adaline. Adaline came from the word adaline, French word, Arab word of adaline, adal. And we thought that is the gene. And at this time, Maghrebian myopathy, because they are Algerian, Tunisian myopathy, a lot of competition between Fardo and Ben Hamida, who was very good friends, huh? And they are both are my boss. That is the history, but good to remember this. But rapidly, the gene of Tunisian patients have been mapped to chromosome, cloned as gamma and not alpha-sarcoglycan. And afterward, our genetic adventure started with mapping the gene of Mayoshi by Khamis Abjawi, cloning the gene of Mayoshi, a large collaboration including Saeed Bouhliga and Edward Kepler with Conker and Bob Brown. And in 2001, we mapped gene of LGMD to 2I because large families. And now, since this time, we have 26 different genetic forms of LGMD2. 30 years before, they didn't exist. And you understand that genetics is giving us a lot of opportunities, and I hope a lot of hope for treating these diseases, because probably a lot of genes are easy to be treated more easily than Duchenne muscular dystrophy. They are more rare than Duchenne in some countries. And here is the classification of LGMD2. LGMD2, what means it's autosomal recessive LGMD, from A to Z. I don't know if we'll find another, how they will call him. Z1, Z2, Z3, I don't know. In any case, 26 different forms of autosomal recessive limb girdle muscular dystrophy. Many of them looks like Duchenne. That is just for the sarcoglycan when we are starting, how it have been found, how it have been. What is the phenotype, what we call it, gamma sarcoglycanopathy or LGMD, Tunisian muscular dystrophy? It's exactly, you see the boy and the sister. When you see the boy, we say Duchenne. Impossible to distinguish it from Duchenne about all the clinical phenotype, the age of onset, the progression, high CK level, and dystrophic picture. But dystrophin was normal, and sarcoglycan, gamma sarcoglycan is absent, and other subunit may be present or diminished or absent. What is important also, that the large majority of Tunisian patients have founder mutation, DEL 521. All of them must mean that they have common ancestor. The same mutation have been found in Algerian and in Moroccan patients, and another mutation have been found in Libyans and in some families in south of Tunisia. It's why I asked for Dr. Nagia if what kind of gamma of sarcoglycan they have. That is why there is founder mutation. Or if Tunisian patients came from the one region? No, they are spread in all the country. And it is very rare in Europe. I understand why we started by genetic before biopsy. It has been found in Arab Saudi and in Kuwait. Alpha-sarcoglycan, that is the adeline gene. It's more frequent in Europe, in our country. We have two families. And there is no founder effect in this disease. Clinical phenotype is severe. And, of course, all sarcoglycan are absent in this disease. Beta sarcoglycanopathy, more frequent in Brazil. We have only one family. We didn't find another. The same phenotype, even more severe than Duchenne, or like the severe form of Duchenne. And it was reported also in Arab Saudi, so much in, I think, in Arab Saudi, but we have maybe not so detailed report until now. And delta sarcoglycan didn't exist in our country. LGMD2B with Tsumayoshi, described in Japan, reported in family in gene, have been mapped in family from Tunisia. We know that it's frequent in all North Africa, in Arab Saudi. I think that is the first muscular dystrophy, and have special clinical phenotype. And of course, it mapped for the gene is dysferlin. LGMD2I is very interesting because we have only one family, which allowed to found the gene, have not been able to identify it. British group have do is FKRP. It is frequent, not so frequent, and it's milder than what we call it Duchenne-like muscular dystrophy. It started in the second decade. Of course, muscular dystrophies, everything have been found. What about LGMD2 in Tunisia? That is very important for routinely clinical. When you see the patients, we studied 1,200 patients around. Duchenne represent almost 40% for severe muscular dystrophy. 60% have dystrophy normal, what means that they are not Duchenne. It's why we didn't do genetic testing before. It is so expensive because we do MLPA, we do genetic sequencing, or it's negative and you come back to biopsy. It's why we started by muscle biopsy. I think each country have to establish the strategy of diagnosis of muscular dystrophy in his country. And that is the percentage of all the gene found. LGMD2C is most frequent. LGMD2B, 2D, and the gene was found in, of course, 63% identified. Why? Because we have the molecular diagnosis only in 60%. 40% of patients with dystrophy normal, severe autosomal recessive muscular dystrophy are waiting for finding their genes. For next generation of neurologists, if they will lose next generation sequencing, probably they will find a lot of new genetic forms in Tunisia, preparing the next generation. What's the problem with LGMD2C? Two big problems now we have. First, intrafamilial variability. Second, genetic intrafamilial genetic heterogeneity. That is very, 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 very difficult task. Intrafamilial variability. All Tunisians have the same mutation, but the clinical phenotype is different. Some have severe, but in the same family, some may have mild course. We have patients who died when they are 20 years, and we have still patients who have 64, 55, and still living in wheelchair bound, but living. The second question, why this disease? Patients cannot have children, usually. when this mutation became so frequent and remain frequent in Tunisia, even if the patients who are carrying the disease cannot have children. Probably when they are heterozygotes, maybe that is genetic advantages or like this. We think that probably this why the disease remained frequent in our country. Finish? Oh, I will finish. The second problem is genetic heterogeneity. What means that in the same family, we can find two forms of genetic different. Severe Duchenne-like muscular dystrophy, one alpha and other sarcoglycan. The second, corticosteroids works exactly like in Duchenne or even better. And we did the first gene therapy with Geniton. It works locally, and Geniton stopped this project with gamma sarcoglycanopathy, even if I think that the gene is very short and it is possible to do it. And thank you, because it is time.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very glad to be with you here today. To start with, we are talking today about clinical outcome measures in neuromuscular disorders. I guess you would agree with me that many aspects in the field have advanced dramatically, but when it comes to the outcome measures in neuromuscular disorders, it receives less attention. In general, outcome measures are better delineated in diseases like spinal muscular atrophy and Duchenne muscular atrophies, to a degree that should reflect how far they reach in terms of therapeutic developments, as bringing these therapeutics to patients usually require clinical trials to use good clinical outcome measures. Saying that, I'm going to focus my outcome measures today that I'm going to discuss about spinal muscular atrophy and Duchenne muscular atrophy. But again, the principles and some of these measures should be applicable to a wider range of neuromuscular disorders. In general, in neuromuscular disorders, we need an outcome measure that reflects a specific disease and the disabilities of that disease. We need to incorporate these set of outcome measures into our daily clinical practice to evaluate the baseline status of patients, monitor the disease progression, and trying to predict the natural history of the disease. If there is any intervention, we need to evaluate the effect of that intervention, and guiding the care or informing our clinical decision-making in starting therapeutics or changing these therapeutics, whether in clinical practice or even clinical trials. Outcome measures can be biomarkers, meaning that measures that reflects the biological characteristic of the disease in the question. These biomarkers could be metabolites in the blood or cerebrospinal fluid, electrophysiological measures, or maybe like here, dystrophin expression in muscle biopsies. These biomarkers usually are very useful in the early phases of clinical trials when you need a proof of the concept of the presumed mechanism of action of that intervention. Or sometimes in a later efficacy trial or the early phases of efficacy trials, you need the biomarkers rather than the clinical outcome measures because they are very sensitive to the treatment effect. Then we have the clinical outcome measures, which simply just measure what is really important from patient perspectives. The optimum outcome measure, among other criteria, should be an age appropriate. If we use an outcome measure that fit or across all age groups, would be less sensitive. Saying that it is important to use a developmentally appropriate scales, especially for the very younger children. Outcome measures should be easy to implement in different centers with different resources and suitable for multi-center studies. It should show sensitivity to change or responsiveness to treatment, able to yield natural history data and normative ranges. An outcome measure that is a disease-specific would be an ideal, but because it would reflect, the unique characteristic of that disease, the functional disability particular for that disease. But that is not really mandatory, since, like, in general, children with weakness, they have relatively the same functional disabilities. Functionally meaningful. This is very important, but it's quite hard to define because of the variability that we see among different diseases in the neuromuscular disorders, or even within the same individual neuromuscular disorder. What is clinically meaningful for an 18-year-old child with Duchenne muscular dystrophy is totally different from an 18-year-old child with Duchenne. Saying that, or in other words, what should fulfill clinicians' or patients' expectation of clinical meaningfulness is the acquiring new abilities. New abilities that is not really expected from the natural history of that disease. What these abilities will that depend on the stage of the condition of the child. It is always best to build on existing tools rather than inventing a new outcome measures, just to take the advantage of the existing data available for that outcome measure, and using the natural cohorts already established on that disease, and most importantly, to make use, if there is regulatory approval of that particular outcome measure. These are just an examples of the most commonly used outcome measures in neuromuscular disorders in Duchenne and SMA. In general, how a child or how a person navigates their environment is quite meaningful and noticeable for both the child and the clinician. As a result of weakness, endurance, and balance, all of them are affected, and these should be quantified in the outcome measures. Starting with the 6-minute walking test. Well, this was designed originally for to measure the exercise capacity in children with cardiopulmonary diseases, but later on was widely adopted in neuromuscular disorder within an adult or pediatrics. It is easily administered, no much of equipment, no much of that dedicated to training, but standardization is quite essential. It has been used most commonly in Duchenne clinical trials and also in the natural history trials. It is very reliable and reproducible, and is actually one of the outcome measures that received FDA approval. Let's see here, 6-minute walking test as an outcome measure that delineate the natural history data in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, for example, in this. So 6-minute walking test data showed that those children above 7 years of age showed a rapid decline in comparison to those below 7 years of age. The baseline walking abilities using 6-minute walking test as a measure was also useful, where it showed that a decline is associated with a rapid decline in the next coming 2 years. And that's really in light of the natural history data of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. 6-minute walking test also showed a responsiveness to treatment. And this is just an example from one of the pivotal trial in Duchenne muscular dystrophy using eteplirsen. And it showed that a mean difference of more than the minimum clinically important difference of 30 meters. Another scale, which is the North Star Ambulatory Assessment. While the 6-minute walking test is non-specific, the North Star Assessment Scale is quite specific for Duchenne. It's designed specifically for Duchenne muscular dystrophy patients. It is validated, reliable, and very practical tool assessing the activity of daily living activities. And the order of items actually in the scale follows the disease progression. It is like internationally used in many clinical trials. And here an example that it shows that it is consistent with the 6-minute walking test in showing the responsiveness to treatment, as it's the case here in eteplirsen or the exon skipping therapy. Another scale, the Hammersmith Functional Motor Scale. This scale was originally developed to measure motor abilities in type 2 SMA, but later on it was revised to include both ambulatory and non-ambulatory SMA patient. It is a 33 items scales designed to delineate the pattern of weakness in SMA patients. In each function, in a different level of ability are depicted from the left to the right. The suitability of this scale in SMA patient comes from the fact that it is specific for the disease, but most importantly, there is a minimal burden on patients where you can complete the test within 15 minutes or so. Here, the Hammersmith scale has been used as a primary outcome measures in the Church trial affecting the, assessing the efficacy of nusinersen therapy in type 2 SMA. And again, it's showing responsiveness to treatment. Another scale, and this is a developmentally appropriate scale, the CHOP and TENT. The Children's Hospital Philadelphia Infant Test of Neuromuscular Disorder, but most commonly simply we call it the CHOP and TENT. This scale is developed specifically for the weak type 1 SMA, and it's like a 16-item scales, and it just includes an active and elicited movements of head, neck, and trunk, and assessing the proximal and distal muscle strength. Again, CHOP at TED was used actually as a secondary outcome measures in type 1 SMA, as obviously, primary outcome measures in SMA type 1 would be more towards, time to survival and time to use respiratory, ventilatory support. When patient is non-ambulatory, it would be essential to use a tailored assessment for their level of functioning in daily life. Here, as an example, in SMA, we use the revised upper limb module in both actually ambulatory and non-ambulatory patients, and it can be used as young as 30 months of age, and it can be completed actually quick, in 15 minutes or so. It has been used, again, as a secondary outcome measures in the Church trial in type 2 SMA, where it showed responsiveness to treatment. Another outcome measure, which is quite essential, and we do use in our daily clinical practice, is the assessment of respiratory muscles. The weakness in neuromuscular disorder is not specific to skeletal muscles, and the use of forced vital capacity as an indirect measure of muscle strength is quite essential. It was very useful to delineate the natural history as in the Synergy natural history data in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which was useful to be used as a comparison arm when it comes to evaluate the efficacy of atallurine therapy in Duchenne muscular dystrophy patients. Another aspect of outcome measures I want to highlight is the patient-reported outcome measures. A person's quality of life is determined by many dimensions. The physical well-being as well as psychological and social factors. The suitability of any intervention shouldn't be assessed by its effect on the disease status alone. We need to consider quality of life. The pediatric quality of life questionnaire is one of the widely used measure, and it actually has been used in healthy children, children with acute or chronic condition, but we have a dedicated neuromuscular module that has been validated in SMA and Duchenne muscular dystrophy patient, and it has been used as a secondary outcome measure in many clinical trials. These questionnaires actually has been translated in many different languages, but not yet in Arabic. And in saying that, it is really notable and a very wonderful effort that we need to follow, the one done by our colleague in neuromuscular disorders, where they translated and validated the Arabic version of quality of life in myasthenia gravis. Saying that, I want to conclude that yes, we know that there are variability over the spectrum of neuromuscular disorders, even within the same individual neuromuscular disorder, so that a single outcome measure wouldn't be able to capture all aspects of the disease. As such, combination of outcome measure would be optimum to capture the clinically meaningful difference from different aspects. Most importantly, we need to understand what outcome measure to use, when and why, or were appropriate to use in our clinical practice. In our center, for instance, we started with one skilled physiotherapist, neuromuscular physiotherapist 3 years ago, but now we have like a team of 4 skilled neuromuscular physiotherapists. Yes, a change may take years to happen, but we need to implement these outcome measures as an integral part of our daily practice. Thank you very much.
No, it's the
This one?
Yes.
What you think, doctor?
I'll see. Yes, I'll see. I'll call you. Thanks for the introduction. I'm now back with a totally different subject, GNE myopathy, and not GNA myopathy as written in the program. This is GNE, okay? And we're going to explicit what it means. You probably know that apart from the proximal myopathies we know, and we talk a lot about limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and so on, most of them are proximal. There's still a subset of patients with distal weakness, which is distal myopathy, okay? And again, this is a very complex group of diseases with not so many patients, but still, they are around. They are misdiagnosed most of the time because there are very, very few experts. And the second point is that it is extremely heterogeneous from the genetic viewpoint. This is just not a dated list of genes related to distal myopathy. There are approximately 20, but most probably there are 30 or 40, we don't know yet. So again, this is very difficult. This is very challenging. And some of you might be familiar with some names like Verlander myopathy, Miyoshi myopathy that Faisal mentioned, and many other diseases. And GNE myopathy is actually one of them, okay? GNE myopathy is somewhere down. It belongs to a subset of distal myopathies called the autosomal recessive forms. And it has some distinctive features that we're going to comment later on. For a clinician, again, this is pretty complex because when you face a patient with distal weakness, first of all, you never know whether it's neuropathic or myopathic. Obviously, when the CK are very, very elevated, that's fine. That's definitely myopathic. But when it's just borderline CK, it's difficult to say. Second, EMG studies may tell you, yes, this is more neurogenic or more myopathic, but sometimes there's overlapping as well. So it might be confusing. So actually, and I think this is very instrumental for clinicians, you can rely on this algorithm. Okay, first of all, you need to know whether it's autosomal dominant or autosomal recessive, okay? But be careful, because especially in the region, we're also dealing with patients presenting with pseudo-dominance that we will comment later on. Then obviously you need to know whether it's an early onset condition or just late onset, because again, the genes are different and the disease is different. And eventually we'll also take into account the topography of distal weakness. As you obviously know, there's the anterior compartment, okay? The foot flexors, and the posterior compartment, foot extensors, okay? The calf muscles versus the tibialis anterior, for instance. And based just on this difference, you can also actually predict the kind of genes that are going to be involved. So GNE, actually, if you look at the diagram here, is just down there. I think we can even use this. Let me take a pointer. Okay, can you? Yes. Okay, so GNE is here. And again, it's recessive. It affects mostly the anterior horn, the anterior compartment of the leg, of the lower leg, and that's it. But obviously, that's not always true in real life. As you all know, there are exceptions. When patients present late in life with a very advanced stage of disease, then it's more difficult. But just keep this in mind. I think it's very, very important. Now, the disease itself, and it's, again, a bit confusing for clinicians. There's different names, synonyms. You probably heard of especially the senior doctors in this room, they all, the so-called Nonaka type distal myopathy that our friends, our Japanese colleague described in 1981. But there's also another name called the quadriceps sparing myopathy, QSM, described by another prominent specialist in Israel, Professor Argoff, back in 1984. And then other people started using the term hereditary IBM. Oh, IBM. But be careful, it's not inclusion body myositis. It's inclusion body myopathy, totally different. This one is genetic. But nowadays, and that's true, there's a consensus, it's pretty rare in neuromuscular diseases, but there's a consensus to call this disease GNA myopathy, full stop. Okay? So how do we recognize this disease? As I said, it's recessive. In most cases, it's an adult onset, no problem, around age 20, perhaps a little bit early, depends. And the major feature is distal weakness, for sure. Foot drop, bilateral foot drop, progressive foot drop for many years. What's striking, but actually we don't pay attention much to it, is what we call the preservation of quadriceps. The quadriceps is very strong, almost healthy for many, many years, if not decades. Only at the latest stages of the disease, then he may be affected, but usually it's quite good. Then the CK, what about the CK? Usually the CK are not a clue because they're usually normal. In most cases, sometimes they're slightly elevated. EMG findings, be careful, can be misleading. Obviously, because we're dealing with the distal myopathy, you expect to have a myopathic pattern. But in some cases, we found neurogenic findings too, so it's a bit tricky. Now comes the issue with the muscle biopsy. Again, we're doing less and less biopsies nowadays, but if you perform one, you would expect to find specific lesions, like ringed vacuoles, good. Like filamentous inclusions in the muscle fiber, good. The problem is that you will find this if you target the right muscle. If you, for instance, target a shoulder muscle or a quadriceps muscle, you may not find these lesions. And you said, oh no, there's no ringed vacuoles, there's probably not GNA myopathy, and you would be wrong. Another point is the absence of inflammation. Already, I mentioned the fact that it's different from IBM, sporadic IBM, in which there is inflammation. Here, in 90% of cases, there's no inflammation. That's, again, a very distinctive feature for GNA myopathy. And obviously, the ultimate test to confirm that it's a GNA myopathy is genetic study. And hopefully nowadays we've got access to NGS, easy sequences, panels of genes, and the GNA gene is almost always in this panel. So clinically, again, patients will present with foot drop, okay? But when you see a foot drop here, well, you think of CMT, you think of other things, many other things, and GNA will be probably the latest thing you'll be thinking about. So be careful. Foot drop plus, as shown here, the quad is totally normal. And this is quite striking. Similarly, this is another patient we saw. He had a more advanced stage of the disease. He was in his 60s there, and he had, again, a very marked distal weakness, total foot drop, but his quad was extensively good. He had a bit of scapular winging here and distal weakness in the hands. So again, this was more diffuse, more advanced form of GNE. Similarly with the French patients of us, the clue here was given by the MRI. And this is a very simple, cheap, conclusive, in a sense, investigation. And again, this is very striking when you have such a healthy quadriceps as opposed to hamstrings which have totally disappeared. This is a good clue. Again, this is not specific. You can see that also in calpain deficiency, for instance. But in calpain deficiency, you will not see a weak TA, okay? Here, that's what's shown here. So just based on the MRI, you could suspect GNE very much. Perhaps if I'm lucky, I'll show the video at the end. Again, the pathology here. If you perform a muscle biopsy, try to target either the TA, but it's not an easy muscle to biopsy, and you may come across rim vacuoles like here. That's nice, great. If you perform EM studies, ultrastructural studies, then again you will find this filamentous, you will find autophagy, which is also a prominent feature in GNE myopathy and so on. And there are some beta amyloid deposits in the muscle, but this is not routinely done, believe me. The only thing which is routinely done is the first stain with the trichrome, where you find ring vacuoles. And again, in ultrastructure, you will find some filaments here, but this is not essential for the diagnosis. So, okay, so we have clues, we have a clinical phenotype, but what else could it be? And again, we have a long list of differential diagnoses, and that's why most of these patients are overlooked. They've been given another diagnosis, like CMT, like a Miyoshi myopathy because it was distal. They've been given limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, scapuloperoneal syndrome, even FSHD, facioscapulohumeral muscular dystrophy, etc., etc. So there's a long list of errors. And the reason is because, again, clinically, there's an overlap between all these syndromes. Okay, so GNA is in the middle, but can mimic all sorts of diseases. In terms of prognosis and disease course, we used to say that it's a benign disease, but it's not a benign disease, believe me. It starts late, that's true, around age 20, but patients may develop severe weakness within 10 years of time. And by age 30 or 40, they might be wheelchair-bound, okay, which is not good. Even though they may have a good quadriceps, they will be in a wheelchair. So it's slow, but there are exceptions. It is more or less related to the different mutations we have and so on. But in general, there's no cardiac issues, there is no respiratory issues, so these patients are going to survive very long, in their 60s, in their 70s. From a genetic viewpoint, we know a lot about the disease now. We have a gene, that's the GNA gene. So the gene was cloned many years ago in the 90s. There were two competing groups, one in Japan and the other one in Israel, and they eventually agreed on the fact that it was the same disease and the same gene, hopefully. And that's the GNA gene. So that's the complete name of the gene. It's far too much complicated for me, okay? That's why we have this acronym GNE, much easier. Oh, so we have a name, we have disease, we even have a pathogenesis there. We know that this gene is a key gene, a key enzyme in the sialic acid metabolism. We need this enzyme to produce sialic acid. And sialic acid is essential for many of our glycoproteins or many other proteins or lipids, whatever. You need sialic acid to survive, otherwise you're dead. Okay? So we know all this. We know that the gene is up there here, controlling at least two key pathways here. And you're going to use the different substrates. You will use this enzyme to catabolize this substrate and so on, leading finally to the exportation of sialic acid on your glycoprotein, and this glycoprotein will be put to the membrane. That's how it works, and that's why GNA is so essential. Interestingly, GNA is almost everywhere. It's a ubiquitous disease, found in many countries, in many latitudes whatsoever. Mutations are spread all over the gene, as you will see. Most patients are compound heterozygotes. Most mutations are missense. And there are a few founder mutations, and I'm going to show you one of them. Be careful if you're really interested in GNA myopathy, and if you look back at the literature, you will find that the mutations have not the same name. The reason is because the nomenclature has changed over the years. They found an extra exon, so they had to change the whole thing. And that's why, for instance, we have a very common mutation in the region, had two different names now. We're going to get back to it. So this is the distribution of the different mutations we know. I'd like to draw your attention to this one in yellow here, okay, which is extremely prevalent in the Middle East first, but also in California. And I'm going to tell you why later on. Actually, in the Middle East, it's been described originally in Persian Jews living around Tehran and Mashhad. But these Jews migrated to Israel years ago, and therefore there is a big cluster of patients in Jerusalem and around, described by Igoth, that's why. And the same mutation is also found in Californians, but those Californians are actually Jewish Persians who migrated from Iran years ago again. So we have this mutation originally in Persian Jews, but actually we found it also in the region here in Bedouins, in non-Jewish Iranians, and so on and on. So it's there definitely. And let me tell you what we've done together with Hadil is somewhere here, and Abdullah Al-Ajmi is there too. A couple of years ago, we described one single patient or one single family with GNA myopathy, just based on the clinical presentation and the genetic analysis. And I think she was Kabila, she's here. Again, huge family, consanguineous family, 2 or 3 affected members in the family. Typical presentation, foot drop, wheelchair bound, meaning that, and she was 32 or so it's pretty severe. Okay, then a second family came. Again, this is Kabila. The other one was not Kabila, anyway. And a brother too was affected. And again, look at the phenotype. It looks like CMT. It looks like Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease. You know, very, very distal and very, very much wasted. So again, we said. And then we asked, what's your family name? And said, well, we are Alanese. Oh, but the first family was also Alanese. So all of a sudden, we started looking after all the Alanese in Kuwait, having distal weakness and foot drop. And it turned out to be almost confined to the same tribe, actually, in Kuwait. So this is another girl from Kuwait, another lady, Hafaf. This is a Saudi girl, but living close by to Kuwait, near Dammam. And this one is tricky. I wanted to tell you why. This gentleman here, okay, had his sister affected, but mum was also affected. How come? You're expecting this is an autosomal recessive family. So what happened there? And the reason is it's because of pseudo-dominance, okay? So mom was a carrier, but she also married a carrier, and so on and on. Okay, so we have an explanation for that. And I must say that this gentleman, who's a very nice gentleman, I think he's also an Alanese, to my recollection. Actually, he was investigated in the West, not with us, but with another hospital in Germany. And they've been looking for all sorts of different diagnoses, but not GNA myopathy. They even said, oh, he probably has calpain deficiency whatsoever. Well, I don't know. It was GNA myopathy for sure. So we have many of these patients. If you're interested, Hadil wrote a very nice paper compiling all these cases from Kuwait. We have about 16 cases till now. But, and this is a message for you guys, is that it's there also in Saudi Arabia. Ed Kapler, a couple of years ago, reported 3 unrelated Saudi families in an abstract. Just recently, I talked to Mohammed Al-Juma from Riyadh. He also has, I think, 2 or 3 families with similar stories of foot drop and with GNA myopathy. So GNA myopathy is there, and it's most probably the same founder mutation that we found all over the region. So keep this in mind and try to review all your cases. Once you diagnose such patients, my advice is to register them into the international registry. Why is it so useful? Because, as you probably know, we are trying to design clinical trials and to find new medications for these patients. And for that, we need to know where patients are. And this is very useful. This is free. There's an Arabic version for it, so that's fine. Because obviously, we have much hope and in effect to find and discover medications or interventions in general for this disease. It's a metabolic myopathy in a sense. We have an enzyme, we know it's mutated, we know the substrates. So obviously many of us try to supplement these patients in sialic acid directly, okay? We did that a couple of months ago, as I'll show you. But gene therapy might be useful too, as we may see in the future. It's not yet ready, but there are a team working on that. So regarding the metabolic therapy, we're not going to replace the enzyme like in Pompe disease, but we're just going to provide substrates, additional substrates. So we did that with the stove substrates here, MANAC and NUAC. So MANAC actually has been, shouldn't say a disaster, but it didn't work properly, okay? It didn't work. And now what's left, so this is the MANAC study done by Ultragenics, and the final outcome was pretty disappointing. No impact on muscle weakness, nothing at all. So we stopped the trial, and the drug is just left aside. But hopefully, our colleagues at NIH, Nuria, Carrillo, and others are still clinging to MANAC for another type of approach, and we hope this time it's going to be more successful. Okay? Okay, so the take-home message, and I think just on time. Again, you need to combat what I call diagnostic odysseys. That is, patients that you have with so-called unclassified LGMD, unclassified CMT, whatsoever. Okay, think about GNA myopathy. Hopefully, the GNA gene is nowadays on most panels of gene. If you order a NGS, my guess is that you're likely to find a gene, the genetic defect in those patients, okay? And again, the best clues, perhaps we could show the video, but there is a specific clinical pattern. And be prepared to join clinical trials in the very next future, because there's so many patients around that I think having a clinical trial site in Riyadh, another one perhaps in Kuwait, would really make sense, okay? So shukran kathira for your attention. Perhaps if you give me just 30 seconds, if the video, but it's not sure it's going to work. You see something now? Well,
Yes.
yeah, okay. So keep this pattern, okay. It's a mix of steppage, okay, and proximal weakness. It's a mix. So when you see such people, such a gait, think about GNA myopathy, believe me. Okay, it's easy, and I'm pretty sure you have some. They have some in Tunisia, and I guess you will comment it. You're welcome.
This is the part back after you finish.
thanks again for this kind of presentation. And this is an enlargement of some concepts we have already discussed this morning with talking about Pompe disease. This is a larger field, and I will try to touch different topics during my presentation, trying to get your interest about clinical features, diagnostic investigation, clinical pictures, main clinical pictures, and therapies where they are available. So you know that you've seen several pictures like that, schemes with classification. And as you can see that the metabolic myopathies are, doesn't seem to work. Oh, okay. A very large group of myopathic disorders, including lipid storage, muscle glycogenosis, and mitochondrial disorders. So it's impossible to talk properly of every kind of different group of disease, but I'll try to give you a flavor of every single group. In here, you can see that there is a very relevant mechanism that is interrelated between the glycogen and glucose metabolism, lipid metabolism, and mitochondrial metabolism. So you know that all of these metabolisms are really interrelated. And if you look at the metabolic sources for the usual energy producing the sustaining the muscle exercise, you know that the glycogen content in 1 gram is 1 gram for 100 grams of fresh muscle. And what happens when the muscle has to be exercised? At rest, utilizes mainly fatty acids. When there is exercise at submaximal level, a low intensity, the muscle, the skeletal muscle uses more blood glucose and free fatty acids, at higher intensity glycogen, and finally, when the exercise is really intense, the major fuel comes from glucose. And of course, you have several disorders, several genes, and several mechanisms. And some of these mechanisms are quite well known. You know that, for example, all the muscle glycogenosis are affected because there is an ATP depletion, but specific kind of muscle glycogenosis, for example, myocardial disease, is based on a sodium-potassium pump alterations related always with ATP production. There are some specific mechanisms where the myofibrils are totally invaded by autophagic vacuoles or glycogen deposition, as in Pompe disease, but you'll see also in the brancher deficiency. And paradoxically, although it's called muscle glycogenosis type 0, this is the inverted situation where there is no production of glycogen, and when you perform one specific stain, which is the PAS, specific for glycogen, you cannot find any reactivity, but it's very rare cases. And for lipid storage, you have a dysfunction in muscle fibers because, again, they are invaded by lipid vacuoles, and you'll see in a minute. And finally, the oxidation phosphorylation alterations are the main mechanism in mitochondrial disorders. So generally speaking, you can see here a sort of summary of what are the main symptoms and signs in metabolic disorders, especially exercise intolerance, fatigue, myalgia, muscle contractures. I would like to outline that when you have to deal with metabolic disorder, you don't have cramps. The cramp is a neurogenic phenomenon, but the contractures are the real symptoms you can hear from the patient. And also hypercemia, rhabdomyolysis, myoglobinuria with dark urines, in all the cases where there is an acute presentation. In a chronic presentation, you have, of course, muscle weakness and also reduction of the bulk of muscles. And this is a quite well-known scheme that has been done by the group of Billy Di Mauro in Colombia and renewed by one of my ex-pupils, Emanuele Barca, who is still now in Colombia. And you can see that there are two main forms. The dynamic form or acute form characterized by myalgia, myoglobinuria, hypercikemia, and the chronic form or fixed form where the main symptoms are muscle weakness and atrophy. So how can we study this kind of metabolic disorders when we suspect them? And this is a sort of a diagnostic tree you can use with some differences from one type to another type. So the first evidence should come from the usual measurement of CK or myoglobin or lactate levels, urine analysis, especially for lipid storage disorders, and a blood smear. Blood smear, I'll show you in a minute, is a very relevant, although a little underestimated and easy way to have some suggestion to the diagnosis of metabolic myopathies. Of course, we still use a lot of the neurophysiological examination with electromyography and electroneurography because there are some of these cases where also neuropathy is present. And muscle MRI, it's fundamental. I'll show you better in the talk about limb-girdle myopathies, but it's very important because sometimes, clinically speaking, you can miss some group of muscles involved, and with MRI, you can have a large view about the muscle involvement. Here, there is a sort of a dual direction, because you can go straight for muscle biopsy, and you can also have biochemical and immunohistochemical and non-histochemical results from the muscle biopsy, or if you are more motivated to go to genetics, you can bypass muscle biopsy and biochemistry and go straight to genetics. This, of course, depends on the facility you have near where you work, because if you have a very good laboratory of morphology and biochemistry, probably it's easier to go for muscle biopsy. But if you have a very good laboratory of genetics with a very high expertise level, so it's probably useful to go for genetics. We were discussing about blood smear. I showed you this morning in Pompe disease that it's very important to have sometimes to try to get the blood smear in Pompe disease because it's a very highly sensitive and important for the diagnosis, but also this is a typical Jordan's anomaly you can find in a specific kind of lipid storage myopathy, which is called the Chanarin-Dorfman disease. You'll see later. This is you can see it in leukocytes that using the Sudan black stain you can evidence the vacuoles. Same as in leukocyte for Pompe disease. I showed this morning, and this is also important because it could be also a sort of biomarker of the effects of the ERT in this patient, because you see that after ERT, the number of vacuoles in the last slide are very, very reduced. So we have quite a good experience in our center for metabolic myopathy. You can see that mitochondrial myopathies are the more often seen, but also because of their rarity, lipid storage and glycogenosis. And this is the very recent diagnostic tree for muscle glycogenosis, and you can see that where there is the red spot, there are the deficient enzymes. And this is a case I would like to show you. and I'll tell you why. This is a female, non-consanguineous parents. Since she was 28, she started to complain myalgia and exercise intolerance. And when the blood tests were seen, there was a high level of transaminases. Or you know that sometimes this is a problem because several doctors still make a mistake thinking about a liver disease when they observe high transaminase, but they don't consider CPK. So we had patients that also had the liver biopsy that was completely useless because the problem was in muscle, not in liver. But anyway, when she came to our center, the level of CK was quite high. The neurological examination showed a mild proximal weakness, Gower sign, pes cavus, and reduced tendon reflexes. So there is a sort of mixed presentation between muscle and nerve. EMG showed a slight denervation, and there was also a concentric cardiomyopathy. We performed muscle biopsy, and this is the result. So this is a picture that you can see often in advanced Pompe disease, but it's not a Pompe disease, because when we perform the biochemical assay, the branched enzyme activity was very low. So this is a type-free glycogenosis or the branched deficiency. This was confirmed by the genetic analysis. And that's why I wanted to show you, because when you see the patient sometimes looking at the clinical aspect and looking at the morphological aspect, you may be confused by the possibility that it's a Pompe disease. It's not. It's similar, but it's not the same. And because there are two different forms of the branched deficiency, and one is mainly myopathic. This is another case, quite similar to the previous one. Is a man, since childhood, he complained of fatigue, exercise intolerance, especially after exercise, and the blood test revealed that since childhood he has a high level of transaminases, but no hepatic involvement. And when he was seen at 36 years old, there was a very high level of CK, nearly 2,000. And after several years, he was quite aware that he had this sort of progressive loss of strength. And when he came, we performed the forearm test, and there was no rise of lactate. You know that the forearm test is not specific for any kind of glycogenosis, but is indicative, because when there is a block in the glycolytic chain, there is no production of lactate after the effort, the forearm effort, and this is somehow indicative of the fact that in the glycolytic chain there is a block somewhere. We performed biopsy, and you can see that the slide on the top, the so-called yellow slide, was the diagnostic slide, because on the other end you can see the normal stain for myophosphorylase. You see that the fibers have two different kinds of color, and the yellow one means that there is no reactivity for myophosphorylase. So that one is only the color coming from Lugol stain. And this is a diagnostic for myocardial disease. Also, you can see that there was some accumulation of glycogen. And this was a case of myocardial disease, which is a very dynamic form. There is especially after strenuous exercise, there is hypercemia, rhabdomyolysis, and myoglobinuria. And sometimes this deficiency could also present with the chronic form, because it has been not diagnosed for several years, and you can find some really chronic forms. And this is the mechanism. You can see that once you have a deficiency in ATP, also the strength of the muscles decreases a lot. And we change now the kind of metabolism, and we talk about metabolism of lipid in muscle. You can see this is a very complicated, apparently, representation of the biochemical levels in muscle. And they are all the metabolic disorders coming from lipid metabolism are strictly related to the metabolism of mitochondria. And here you can see that there are different classes of lipid storage myopathies, but what is important is to know how to examine them. So CK can be indicative of a myopathy, but it's not a characteristic. And you have to look for urinary organic acid, especially the acyl-carnitine profile. Acyl-carnitine profile can show you, gives you an address about the kind of level of alterations are present, and different alterations may show different kind of myopathies. This is the picture you can see that follows the muscle biopsy, and you see that there are different levels of lipid vacuoles. In some cases, especially the type 1 fibers are very rich of vacuoles. And this is an interesting case I would like to show you. This is a young man, 20 years old, since here before coming to our department complained of exercise intolerance, mild weakness, contractures, and when we saw him since 2 months before coming to our department, he developed dysphagia, dropped head, difficulty in rising from the bed. It was a very, very, very complicated situation. And also, when if you look at the examination, the neurological examination, there was a severe muscle wasting, dysphonia, dysphagia, ptosis, severe weakness, and very big problems. And even worse at the laboratory, there were very high levels of CPK, LDH, and so on. When we performed the biopsy, we found that there was a very large lipid invasion in fibers. And we also performed the genetics that define this as a MADD, or muscle multiple acyl-CoA dehydrogenase deficiency. And I'll show you the picture. This is the patient before therapeutical intervention. It was very difficult for him to raise the head from the pillow and to raise also the hand and the legs. It's difficult to protrude the tongue. And this was the maximum he was able to do. But after having had that responses from biochemistry and morphology, we started riboflavin, 400 mg per day plus carnitine, and this was the result. In 7 days, the laboratory examination levels were nearly normal, and as well the neurological examination. This is the patient 7-8 days after. So this seems to be incredible, but it's a real truth, because it's important in this case to try to perform the diagnosis, because you really can save the life of those patients. And this is the therapy. And I finish with very few informations about mitochondrial disorders. You can see here the picture of Billy DiMauro, who was and he is still active, although he retired a few years ago, but still active, and was one of the pioneers in mitochondrial disorders in Columbia University. He has formed several researchers in this field. And you know that mitochondrial disorders have a very wide range of presentations that include several organs apart from skeletal muscle, but central nervous system, gastrointestinal system, eye, ear, heart, kidney, liver, and so on. And you can see that somebody has already shown this kind of morphological expression. There are ragged fibers and also COX-negative fibers. But what is important is that sometimes you may have a negative biopsy. Why? Because if you look at the second picture in the middle, sometimes the skeletal muscle fibers is not totally altered. There is a part who is altered, and if you get the biopsy there, it's important. It can give you some ideas about the pathology, but if you get a different part, you might get nothing relevant. And now there is a very concrete classification of mitochondrial disorders, and you know that we don't have to deal only with the mitochondrial DNA, but also with the nuclear DNA and with the intergenomic communication between these two DNAs. And here there is a picture showing that sometimes you have mitochondrial disorders, but this is generated by a nuclear disorder. So that's why in contrast with the previous opinions about the mitochondrial recessive or mitochondrial inheritance, so now we have also autosomal dominant inheritance in mitochondrial disorders because they come from the nuclear DNA. The diagnostic workup is mainly based on the story of the patient, a neurological, cardiac, gastrointestinal workup, laboratory examination, especially for CK, but often with lactate levels that are somehow indicative. And here the more classical syndromes, this is an old classification, but still valid. And you can see that, for example, for Kearns-Sayre or MERF or MELAS, there are specific repetitive symptoms. Here, for example, classically, ptosis and ophthalmoparesis in this patient with Kearns-Sayre syndrome. And we, in Italy, we have a very large network. We included in the record about 2,000 patients coming from all these centers. And very recently, we focused on the presence of multiple lipomatosis in a patient with the usual, we described 16 families with multiple lipomatosis in a patient with the MERF mutation, in other words, 8344. But also we did a lot of work on the MERF phenotype, and the results was quite surprising because in the patient with the usual mutation of MERF, you can get more patients with ataxia rather than myoclonus. And this is a very recent paper done on the screening of pain in mitochondrial patients. And this has demonstrated that pain is very recurrent in mitochondrial patients. This is already done, and I'll show you. And this is, unfortunately, is the slide about therapy. So we don't have much tools to contrast mitochondrial therapy, apart from some cocktails of vitamins, carnitine, and other. But there is only one specific drug for Leber disease, which is not specifically a muscle disorder, but is a very typical mitochondrial disorder, which is diidebenon, which seems to be quite efficient in preserve those patients. So in conclusion, evaluation of patients with metabolic myopathy is very difficult sometimes, but it needs to be done because, as I showed you, in some cases, you really are the main actor for saving life of patients. Sometimes we have to be very precise to get the diagnosis, otherwise the patient receives only a frustrating diagnosis. And this is a general opinion, especially I believe in this. We should get the diagnosis as early as possible, because in some cases, as Pompe disease or MADD or some mitochondrial disorders, as soon as you have the diagnosis, you can start very early the therapy where it is present. Thanks very much.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for attending this lecture and being patient to listen to me after this heavy day full of information and knowledge. And I would like to thank Dr. Aisha Sharif and Dr. Kubler for inviting me to attend and to present in this lecture. My talk today is about trying to make some combination between clinical and radiological assessment to reach a diagnosis in some inherited muscle diseases. This work was presented in the Radiological Society of North America as an educational activity in 2014. And as you know, muscle diseases, although rare, they include large diversity of subtypes, and most of them share common clinical phenotypes. This makes categorization of and diagnosis of these muscle diseases is a real challenge for neurologists. So you need to success in making a good diagnosis and to help your patient. To make this success, you need keys. And neurologist knows that in muscle diseases, we have a lot of keys to reach the diagnosis, to probably assess the weakness, to detect the presence of pain and muscle cramps, wasting, contraction, as mentioned before regarding glycogen storage disease, the presence of myoglobinuria. Some muscle diseases have myoglobinuria early in the course of the disease. Some other muscle diseases have them late. The presence of cardiac and respiratory involvement. You can see some muscle diseases that have cardiac and respiratory failure early in the course of the disease. While the patient is still ambulating, you see that he is having respiratory failure or heart failure. Other muscle diseases like Duchenne, for example, the patient is sometimes develop this cardiac and respiratory failure late in the disease. Sometimes you face muscle diseases like dyspharinopathy or Miyushi myopathy, you do not have regular cardiac or respiratory involvement. So these differences, you can, as a neurologist, you can make them as a key to reach the diagnosis. For sure, the family history, autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, and here in our communities, the issue of pseudo-dominance. It is very, very common in our communities. We have a lot of consanguineous marriage, and if you do a very good family tree, you will find this pseudo-dominance appearance is very, very frequent. Associated symptoms, when you go to the serum CK, MRI, muscle biopsy, cardiac function, and the rest of the investigations. Still, the master key to reach the diagnosis is to do genetic testing. Whatever you do, genetic testing will help you to reach the final diagnosis. During the assessment of patients with muscle diseases, muscle imaging is very, very important. We used before to use the muscle image to choose the site of muscle biopsy, but nowadays we now started to have a pattern of involvement in different muscle diseases. So when you look to the MRI muscles of the patient, from the MRI you can nearly spot a diagnosis or reach a diagnosis. But and the use of MRI or the imaging in muscle diseases is very helpful in making even a short list of diagnoses. In Egypt, sometimes we do not have the facility to do full genetic assessment for the patient. So we as a clinician need to make a short list of differential diagnosis through to initiate genetic assessment. This paper was we started to evaluate, to differentiate our patients, categorize our patients clinically into different phenotypes. One of the phenotypes, which is cuff hypertrophy, when the patient is having muscle disease and have bulky muscles. We have other group of patients that have muscle disease associated with wasting. We have some group of muscle disease where they have started early in life, and the fourth group is the patient with having distinctive clinical manifestation. Starting with the group of patients with cuff hypertrophy. As you know from the previous lectures, there are a lot of groups of muscle diseases that can present with muscle disease associated with this bulky cuff. So one of the commonest is Becker. Although Becker is a dystrophinopathy, it's not one of the limb girdle muscular dystrophy, but because it's very common, it is wise to think about Becker muscle disease, Becker muscle dystrophy in any male presenting with what we call limb girdle muscle dystrophy. So in Becker muscle dystrophy, this is one of our patients. You can see here that the involvement of the gastrocnemius and the soleus are more or less similar. If you go and to compare this to the same patient presenting with limb girdle muscle dystrophy associated with cuff hypertrophy, you will find a differential affection. You will find here that the soleus muscle, the soleus muscle is affected more than the gastrocnemius. So the patient presented with the same picture, limb girdle muscle dystrophy, hypercemia, and cuff hypertrophy, and just using the MRI can just deviate your attention. Either you are working with dystrophinopathy or you are working with possible sarcoglycanopathy. We have one patient of possible FKRP related mutation. When we have the vastus intermedius is more involved than the other heads of the quadriceps. You feel vastus intermedius is more involved than the lateral and the medial head of the gastrocnemius. When you go to the second group of patients that we clinically, as a clinician, we could categorize them as patients with cuff atrophy, we will have a lot of patients, Calpain, Mayushi, and different types. Clinical presentation of these patients, clinically, you can just pay an attention. It could be Calpain. Patients with Calpain usually having this cuff atrophy, they usually have what we call ankle contraction, so the patient will have somehow two walking, and usually patients with Calpain will walk like this. They have some meetings of the adductors, they have ankle contraction, so as you see them walking with well in the gait and tiptoe walking. And when you saw the MRI, you will find here that there is involvement of the soleus and the medial head of the gastrocnemius. I don't know if you can see here in the slides. You can see that this is the soleus muscle, and you can find that the soleus and the medial head of the gastrocnemius is affected more than the lateral head of the gastrocnemius. So the MRI helps you a bit that you are thinking about this patient could be Calpain. If you compare this again to the patient with also presenting with muscle disease and he's having this cuff atrophy and he's walking like this, they have what we call some heel strike. Those patients do not have contractures at the tendon Achilles, so they're walking, you can see that they are working and they are having this heel strike. And when you look to the MRI, you will find that both heads of gastrocnemius and soleus are affected. So, and you can also spot the differential affection of the vastus lateralis. Sorry. You can, patient with Calpain, they have maintained vastus lateralis. Sorry, the pointer is not available, so. So you can see the vastus lateralis in patient with tail vein is maintained in the upper corner. And then if you compare it to this fellow, you will find it atrophic. So just patient presented with the same presentation, with the same category cuff atrophy, clinically you can differentiate, and with the use of the MRI, you can reach short list of differential diagnosis. We have two patients, started with what we call congenital myopathy, and one of them just was having rigid spine, and we found that she has having weakness or sartorius affection. This is very common in SPD1-related myopathy. Unfortunately, we didn't confirm our diagnosis by genetic test, but the clinical presentation and the radiological appearance helped us to reach a possible diagnosis. The same for patients with central core disease. Patients with central core disease will having a lot of muscle, they have congenital myopathy, they will have skeletal contractures, skeletal deformities, and you will find them that they will have affection of the soleus and the lateral head of the gastrocnemius. So here you can see this is the soleus affected, and this is the lateral head of the gastrocnemius, while the medial head of the gastrocnemius is kept square. Such a pattern, it's not a diagnostic. As I said, the master key is the genetic diagnosis, but clinical assessment using and with the help of radiological assessment, you can reach a possible diagnosis. We just have one patient with presented with such foot drop, and he's having this journey about having peripheral neuropathy or peroneal nerve disease, and we found that he has high CK, and we found this is his MRI, and we said that it could be something of GNE-related myopathy. So in patients with foot drop, he visited a lot of neurology clinic looking for the possible cause of this foot drop, and then with simple use of the MRI, you can spot that this is something related to the muscle, and then you can further arrange for your biopsy or arrange for a genetic assessment. Sometimes we as a neurologist face patients with muscle disease, they can say their diagnosis just by clinical assessment. For example, patient with myotonia, myotonia dystrophica, you can diagnose myotonia without the need of the MRI, without the need of anything. But still you have some peculiar appearance of the MRI in the patients with myotonic dystrophy. The same thing happening with, for example, with facioscapulohumeral. Patient with facioscapulohumeral, you can clinically diagnose them with the clinical diagnosis of facial weakness, scapular weakening, and different clinical presentation. And then we find this involvement of the anterior tibial group. And if we remember Dr. Talal presentation in the morning, he described also that retinopathy is selectively involving the anterior tibial group. And he also mentioned this titanopathy patient are having some scapular weakening, and they have some facial weakness that could remind you with facioscapulohumeral muscle disease. Lastly, I will just present one of my cases. She is a young girl, 18 years old. She is complaining of gradual progressive weakness and contractures. She's had negative family history and no respiratory difficulties. She has this, what you call dry, rough skin. When you look at her skin, you feel it is dry and rough. When you examine her, she's having this contracture at the elbow. And if you do, you will find her contracture at the tendo Achilles, contracture of long fingers. And if you do this test, you'll find that if you do the test in this manner, you will say that she does not have finger flexion contraction. But if you do the test probably doing this, because if the patient will do this thing, doing this, he will not, the flexion contraction will not appear. But if you try to do an adduction of the arm, the contraction will appear, this long flexion contraction. She's having somehow rigid spine, And we did MRI for her, and we found this characteristic appearance when we see the involvement of the quadriceps. This is more or less similar to the pictures presented before in the visualization. So we support the diagnosis of peripheral myopathy. Yes, we do not have the full power to make the genetic test, but we are now using the clinical assessment, and we are using the MRI to reach a short list of diagnoses. But still, MRIs is not without challenges. Exposure of the patient, young children, to the MRI, sometimes it will be difficult. Also, the making diagnosis about the grading of the involvement of different muscles is still area of debate. And sometimes you find the MRIs like this will not help you, either diffuse involvement or diffuse or normal MRI. So still the main message is when you are combining your clinical assessment with your radiological assessment, you can reach a better diagnosis. This also happened even in the presence of next generation sequencing. Sometimes clinicians prefer just take a sample, send it to the next generation sequencing. They will get you all the mutated genes in his body. But I'm expecting that on the long run, you will have this, what we call clinical correlation. As was happened with MRI of the multiple sclerosis, we find white spots. At the start, we say this is MS. Then the radiologists say, no, we see this in different types of disease. So the radiologists say this is for clinical correlation. We are expecting that next time, when years come, that next generation sequencing report will include this clinical correlation. So the take-home message that together we can achieve more if we added clinical to radiological and genetic assessment. We can reach the diagnosis more comfortably, in a shorter way, and in a proper manner, inshallah. Thank you very much.